Hi everyone, thanks so much to the Nasscom team for having us here, and thank you all for being here for this session. I think particularly exciting week to talk about fairness, accountability, transparency and ethics. We've recently seen the US government pass an executive order with a bunch of, trying to do very many different things on regulating, on regulating AI. We've recently seen the UK government conclude a two-day summit, a declaration being signed there, India holding the GPAI presidency this year and the summit coming up in December. So I think lots happening. Of course, China doing, also thinking about regulating AI in different ways. Lots happening around the world. And I think some similarities in how different in how different countries are thinking about regulating AI and implementing, I think, some of these principles that we're talking about in practice. But we're also seeing some sort of divergences in how different countries around the world are looking at this. So with that, Vasu, if I could start with you. If you could give us, if you could perhaps contextualize this debate and the developments that we're currently seeing. And if I could leave you with sort of one, I don't know if this is entirely provocative, but basically experts telling us, hope for the best, but prepare for the worst, right? So how do you see countries responding to this? And if you could contextualize some of these developments for us.
Thank you, Neha. Thank you for the opportunity of deciding the fate of AI in next 25 minutes. And you said about, hope for the best and then prepare for the worst. Of course, 80%, again, the same summit, the same expert said that 80% of AI is good and 20% of AI is bad, and then we need to prepare for the worst aspect of it, right? So first of all, if you're actually looking at this big picture, preparing, hoping for the best, yes, I think we're in a good position there. But preparing for the worst, I don't think so. I don't think we are really thinking about preparing for the worst. One particular aspect, at least in the Indian context, if you see who are all the stakeholders, right, to begin with. Of course, the government, and then these tech companies that are producing foundation models, etc., and then these large industry service integrators and who are actually building a lot of capacity in order to serve the customers and creating goods and services. And then we also have academicians, we have startups, and then we have regular consumers who are sort of directly are using some of these in order to proceed with their day-to-day life, right? These are all the stakeholders that what we have. Now, if you see this entire kind of a picture, there is one thing that worries me, is there is this over-enthusiastic evangelization and mindless adoption of half-baked technologies can be not only counterproductive but also catastrophic if you don't pay attention to all of this, right? So, because of course we are in a good part of the hype curve right now, and there are a lot of things that are happening, but in the larger context, if, especially looking at the government, looking at large enterprises that are sort of educating and kind of creating lots of capacity to do this AI, specifically generative AI stuff, right? These are all elephants, and we need elephant whisperers in order to kind of create capacity so that these bodies listen to what needs to be done. I'll stop.
With that, Balaji, if I can come to you. One of the things, in fact, just to pick up on one of the things that Vasu was talking about, right? Different kinds of stakeholders and the role that different stakeholders sort of, play in this industry. Of course, you wear the industry hat for us on this panel today. So if you could talk to us about, two questions actually, right? One is, how do you identify sort of some of these baseline principles when you're thinking about developing, AI products? What do they look like in practice? Fairness, accountability, transparency, ethics. What does that look like in practice? That's one part of the question. And second is perhaps a little bit more meta. And feel free to take this first. What do you make of the industry's ability even to be a part of this conversation? Or is this something that we're going to necessarily have to see driven by the government and, the elephant whisperer, really?
So I'll probably take I think in that order, and I'll probably answer it in a whole. So the major thing to Vasu's point that the major revolution that we are seeing today is because AI has been, the proliferation of AI, or the way it has manifested and reached a lot of people, right? About 2 years back, I have been in Adobe for 12 years now. I think it is only the last year where we have seen a lot of people being in a position to play with AI, right? And what this has resulted in is sort of using these AI endpoints for almost anything that people can imagine. So as that gets more streamlined, and when we think of the user first at some point, I think that is the major regulation that will start rolling back to the models as well, right? Say almost all of the 4 aspects in FATE. I think when we start thinking about what is the exact user problem that these AI models are setting out to solve, and how does that impact, the usage, the adoption, and things like that, I think a lot of these questions will start.
Could you give us an example?
So, I'll touch. Okay. So if you want, so let me take say the LLMs as an example, right? Do you need an LLM to write up, say, some essay or something like that? So that is a question, right? So now the immediate answer can't say, right? Now when you then go into the next stage where, so one of the previous panelists, what they were talking about, so we can help them fill in a particular form or fill in a particular particular form or something, which is today impossible, right? Now, then the next set of, now we are thinking about a user here where we want to help them fill in a particular form or generate a particular content that they are not naturally suited to do that, right? Now when this comes into the fore, the next set of questions is how do you convince that end user that this is indeed something that is usable, right? Now this comes into the stage where when do you start trusting a particular person, when do you start trusting a particular model or something, when the model is able to say why it was sort of generating or why it is doing certain things a certain way, right? Now that brings in, say, the explainabilities and the accountability of these models, right? So now here this accountability from this particular user problems perspective will be more about how does the model justify why it filled a particular form in a particular way, right? I think now that goes back. So these things are some guardrails and some additional layers that any of these products that are building for, using these AI models, we need to build on that, right? I think of the user, think of what it would need for the user to adopt these AI models, how can these AI models can be more and more explainable, and build the guardrails around that one, right? It is not one size fits all. It comes down to each of these use cases and each of these product needs. I think that is.
So the guardrails will look different for each use
case. Each of these use cases and each of these
each product or each use case or each workflow that we're talking about. So just I'll follow up with you, Vinod, then on that, right? And in fact, I don't know if you want to agree or respond to the last thing that that Balaji said. One, is there even willingness to, or how much willingness, right? In your experience, have you seen to ask some of these first principle questions when you're thinking about product design, building out, etc.? And second, do you see any kind of consensus amongst the different, companies that you might be advising, different folks of the developer community on what some of these principles should look like in practice? So I think it's a 2-part question. One, consensus on adopting, and second, perhaps on implementing as well.
No, that makes perfect sense. And to be fair, ethics and transparency cannot be an afterthought on AI solutions. So from our experience of having developed products in this particular space, be it general purpose AI or generative AI in that sense, ethics, transparency, some of the other practices, principles have to imbibed in the design process in itself. So if I were to call out 4 or 5 principles that we have been following, and the extent to which that gets followed depends on the industry and the use case, right? The thresholds would vary. But first I may call it as the transparency piece. So you need to let your customer know at what point in time he or she is actually interacting with the bot. Now this is something that gets called out in the executive order that the US government released as well, right? They mentioned you need to let the end user know when they are using a bot. In fact, they went a step ahead. They said you need to give the power to the end user that they can switch from a bot to a human agent. That's one. Second principle that we need to have as a guardrail is more around bias. The bias could come from different instances. It could be from your team that you have created. It could be from your data. We heard Kalki speaking earlier around this particularly. It could be around the principles or guidelines that you have published. So you need to be conscious about what you're doing around the bias space of it. Third, very important point that Balaji touched upon, the explainability. Especially if I move away from general purpose AI and more into generative AI, let's say I have a pile of million toys, right? And I'm asking GPT or one of those LLMs, which is Vinod's favorite toy, it will bring up a toy. But how much can it explain what's the logic that it used to bring the toy? Meaning, can it give you the trust? So our principle as an organization has been more around confidence rather than trust. What does that mean? When ChatGPT or one of these LLM shows Vinod, this is your favorite toy, what if it brings across 3 photos of Vinod from his childhood with the toy, which further corroborates or brings in confidence into the bot's response and gives me enough to have faith that this seems to be the right thing. So it's less about trust, I would say it's more about the confidence through which we can achieve the trust. The third and the fourth and the fifth piece is one is around, I would say, resilience. So again, this is something our previous panelists touched upon. There are increased security threats that are there with these technologies. We are all familiar with code injection, what it does. Today, we are writing prompts. Everybody, an end user is writing a prompt. What if one of these prompt generators leads you to write a prompt which breaks one of the systems? That's called as prompt injection. So there are new elements of security threats that you need to be conscious about. Last not the least is the performance. That's the fifth principle that we need to look at when we are building these products. What is the performance threshold that you're setting up? What you're trying to achieve? And thirdly, something that we are looking within our organization as well as, what is the emission that your LLMs are giving out? All of us as an organization have set our net zero goals for a certain year. I don't think many firms have started looking when they adopt Gen AI, what happens to their net zero goals? That's a perspective that needs to be thought as well.
I want to stick with you for a little bit, right? These 5 principles that you identified, would you say that then these are common guardrails across different sectors, across different applications, across different use cases, real world scenarios? Or if we were, if we were thinking about different use cases, can we also, or should we, and can we think about sector specific governance principles, and or do some of these look different, right? So if I'm thinking about fate in the context of healthcare versus thinking about fate in the context of, education versus fate in the context of, again, picking up from the previous panel, access to government benefits, right? So building for different use cases, thoughts on, and any of you feel free to come in, thoughts on, should we regulate differently or should we thinking about some of these first principles differently? Vasu, Balaji, feel free to come in and I'll stick with you.
I would say while the principles generally remain the same, but the appetite to set the thresholds is kindly different, and what kind of an guardrail that you sent around those principles. If I take an example of, I'm asking a suggestion as to what movie I should watch, the output of that is probably the least risky.
Sure.
However, from some of the startups that we were looking in the morning, where we were speaking about precision medicine, the impact could be massive. So the thresholds that you set, the amount of hallucination that you would be willing to accept could be different for each of those use cases. And again, that calls for additional steps in each of these. For example, I spoke out of the resiliency principle, right? In a use case like a healthcare, I might bring in additional guardrails, like I might bring in a human in the loop, reinforced learning. I want to make sure there's a pair of eyes that's always looking at it, even though the recommendation is made by a smart system. There could be elements where I might have an adversarial bot, where a different bot is actually assessing the result of the recommendations that has been made by this particular bot. And again, there are things that can be done on an organizational basis, more from an impact and risk assessment of your use cases. So my thought would be the guardrails are the same, but the thresholds would differ from use case to use case.
Yeah, so just picking up on that, Balaji, if sorry, I know you want to come in. If you could just respond to the last thing, right? One, perhaps just, and to the extent that you can share, how does your organization think about some of these things? And I suppose a little bit more it would help us a little bit more if we could also talk about, okay, so now I'm faced with sort of these 5 principles and then some, right? We can add to that list. We've seen different regulations sort of adding to what, you know, what some of these principles are. How do I pick now, right? And how do I choose which one I want to prioritize? Do I want, you know, yeah, really, how do I prioritize?
So I think one of going back to what I was saying previously, right? I think as any organization, or I mean, me coming from a product company, or any of us who are creating these products, the first person that we are answerable is to our customers, right? And what are those? I think among these principles, what is that they value the most, right? So that is where I think as this. So one of the things that I feel is getting a lot of attention these days is around the data, right? Like what Vinod was mentioning. So when people are aware that what is that, when is at what point people are there, they are interacting with AI, and what point their data is being used by AI, and so those are the kind of transparencies and things that people look for, right? I think so. Therefore, I think one of the major things that that are important as we think of these AI models is around the data governance, right? I think what are the kind of, because ultimately people who have been working on those deep learning models, they can say that so these models are as good as the data that it gets into.
I'm so glad you said data. My follow-up question to you is, what kind of considerations when you're talking about a privacy or a data governance point
No,
of view?
it is more about, so I was getting to that, right? I think in the deep learning models, I think I was talking to one of the faculties from Northwestern yesterday, and they were in another UN summit where they were saying that the real challenge today is what is that model that has learned, and that is essentially going back to what was the data. And when these models become huge, you don't have complete control on all sorts of data that the model is seeing. So you need to put some cap and some confidence on that one. So it comes to what are the kind of, are you doing, picking these models, are these models being trained from anything on the web, or is there, so do you own that content, and what are those things that gets into these models? So that is the first level of guardrail or the data governance that we start with, right? And then, but that is only, that solves only some level of this problem, right? I think this gets into the hands of people who own these more foundation models and others. Now that comes, there comes the other side, right? Now you don't really know what this whole model has seen, and that is, this is a more practical scenario where a lot of applications, you just start with a model, you look at the inference, I mean you're just at the use, I mean you're just at the receiving end of these models, right, where you use these models for various purposes. So now if we put in our user, the end user hat, and we try to figure out what are the places where we are answerable to our end users, so then you can add these additional guardrails. Already there are a lot of works around, say, in all this the text generation spaces, where people are looking at both in the research side on how do you attribute certain parts of these generations, how do you ensure that these models are not hallucinating, what is the world of knowledge that this should limit to, and those sort of things, right? These are the right questions that we ask when we are at the receiving end of these models, so that helps us. So when you have the control on the data governance is important, but when you are not, then asking ourselves these questions on where we are answerable and where we need to be transparent with our customers helps us build some of these things around these models. So I think those are the two things that I feel are critical when it comes to these AI models.
Vasu, I know you had thoughts.
Actually, I wanted to go back to
Yeah,
an
yeah.
earlier question on the domain related, the development of AI. I think this is more complex problem than what generally people perceive this to be. It is not a slider where we move whether you want it to be on the most creative side to more constrained side. It is a lot more than that. It's actually what we are dealing with, especially Gen AI solutions. People are very rushing to adopt. These are all, at the end of the day, are probabilistic models, right? These are not deterministic models.
Yep.
So, I mean, no matter what you do, you cannot depend on the neural intelligence for the mission critical applications and domain specific applications that are very, kind of, they make, at the end of the day, they make or break things, right? So the moment where the symbolic intelligence are married to neural intelligence, that's where I think the success in specific domains will emerge. That's my strong belief. I think by themselves, these LLMs or any other generative AI models will not stand they will not be able to reach the last mile. So symbolic intelligence needs to be brought in. That's my take on the earlier domain-specific things.
Okay. All right. I want to stick with you because I'm also cognizant we've got about 5.5 minutes to go, and I want to very quickly talk about some of these regulatory developments that we're seeing taking place around the world, right? One question is, do you think that it's possible, and again this is an open question for all of you, do you think it's possible to achieve some level of harmonization across developments from different countries that we're trying to see? And second, is it even desirable, right? And building again on what the last panel was talking about, maybe then we'll make this a three-part question, is what do you think India should do in the middle of all of this, right? And what do you think is the best way forward for us as we're thinking about AI regulation, but more importantly harnessing AI for all of the very many things that we want to do with it in this country? So where should, one, do we think that there's going to be harmonization? Is it desirable, not? And what does this mean for India in the middle of all of this, in any order?
Okay.
Yeah.
We can start with you,
yeah,
Vasu,
please.
and then we can go down.
Yeah. I mean, there are a lot of interesting things happening in the last few weeks. US EO to UK summit and so on, and then the AI Safety Institute that is being initiated. I think it's a fantastic initiative. And then also more importantly, there is, there's a committee, an initiative called State of the Science report to be created, which is going to be led by Joshua Bengio, right? I think these are fantastic initiatives that are talking about issues not just within a country, but international, across the boundaries, right? Across industries, across use cases, and so on. I think this is a fantastic initiative. And then, I mean, what you touched upon is a very difficult, very complex issue, bringing in harmony. I remember.
Do we want harmony?
Sorry?
Do you want harmony? Yes, no.
Absolutely, absolutely.
You do?
But then, before going there, I actually remember a cartoon recently, I found in WhatsApp University, where there are these monstrous looking UK, US, China, and European Union sitting on the table. And then in the solid call out, it says that AI should be restricted and we all should work very hard for that. And then in the dotted call out at the bottom, it says, I want to get there first, right? So this is basically the underlying currents that exist everywhere, right? But then, in fact, if you talk from the industry perspective, no one likes regulations. No, I mean, regulations are always pain in the neck. We don't want it as much as possible.
I'm hoping your colleagues disagree with that statement. Do you want to disagree with that statement?
I would say we don't need restrictions, we need controls. Okay. So there's a subtle difference between those two. So restriction will literally slow down the pace of a lot of things. So we definitely don't need restrictions, we need controls so that it's done with certain best practices, etc., right? So we go down that path. I won't touch the regulation piece because it falls somewhere in between.
No, I want you to touch the regulations.
So regulations, my take is, you can draw the analogy from how the financial market evolved. If you go a few years back, everybody used to do their financial reporting in a very independent way. The challenge with that was nobody understood when the report was announced, what do you mean by profit before tax, right? Certain terminologies, because that is very specific to the industry or the company or the organization. So there is that kind of a regulation will bring an element of standardization, which will happen in the AI world as well. But people will start speaking the same language. So somebody, an organization announces this is the technique they are using, everybody else will understand. So I think regulation will be there, that will bring in certain degree of control, that will also bring in standardization in the processes and the terminologies, which makes each of these organizations' solutions interoperable.
Do you prefer any of the regulatory approaches? Do you have a preference out of what you've seen come out of the US versus what you've seen come out of the EU earlier, and what you'd like to see in India? And closing comments on that from all of you.
Yeah, I think we are still at a conceptual level. Both of these regulations, if you look at the US one and the UK, in principle they are speaking about the same thing. They're putting the user first, they're bringing in transparency, they're touching upon security. We need to see to get into the details as to how this gets permeated further down, right? Which will bring us clarity which of those regulations is better.
Do we like the risk-based approach that the EU talks about?
Yeah.
Do we want that? The risk-based approach, basically high risk, regulate high risk differently, and you know.
We actually do that. So we have a 4x4 metrics where we kind of highlight for a use case what's the effort that's needed, the value that is bringing in, and the risk it is posing.
Okay.
So we do a risk-based approach in terms of prioritizing the use cases.
Okay. Closing comments, last one sentence.
I think we don't need to be constrained, we just need to be creative, but we need to create those guardrails and enable the people within
Create
the
guardrails,
organization.
enable no constraints.
Yeah.
User first.
User
and
first.
Think of, I mean, when we really need AI, I think that is a question that I think, but for a country like India, I think for the scale, I think we have scaled a lot of peaks. I think AI is also something that we can scale. But when we start thinking about the millions of users that we have here, I think that will help us have better AI practices in place, and we can be a leader in putting forth what is the best practices.
Think about the user first, and you'll know.
And we have such a large
principles
user base
we'll
here.
know
I think
what principles
we lead
to
it on
follow.
UPIs, we can lead it in AI as well.
Time has come to make the elephants dance.
Okay.
We need elephant whisperers to move the governments and large industry bodies.
Okay,
the right
and
direction.
on that, thank you very much for being a part of this discussion. I think we're exactly at time. And thank you again to the Nasscom team.